Welcome to your storytelling. Enjoy the stories, and don't forget to subscribe. It started out innocent enough, just a work gathering every weekend. At first, I didn't think much of it. After all, he worked long hours, and a few drinks with colleagues didn't seem unusual. But as the weekends turned into routine, I started noticing things. His late arrivals, his distracted attitude when he was home, and most troubling of all, his lack of details about these gatherings. It was as if he was keeping something from me. I confronted him once, jokingly asking, "What's so special about these work drinks that you go every weekend?" He brushed me off with a laugh, claiming, "You know how it is. Just work stuff." But I couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to it. I didn't want to be paranoid, but a part of me began to doubt his words, especially as the weeks went by. Something was changing. Something I couldn't explain, but I could feel it. It wasn't until I started paying closer attention that the pattern became clear. He wasn't just going out for work drinks anymore. No, it was always on weekends, Friday night and Saturday night, without fail. And he never came back the same time. Sometimes it was late. Other times he'd show up in the early hours of the morning, his eyes glazed over, his demeanor off. One Saturday morning, he came home smelling faintly of perfume that wasn't mine. It sent a shiver down my spine. I couldn't deny it any longer. This wasn't normal. It was almost as though he was living a double life, one where he was at work and another where he was somewhere else. I started to question everything, every small detail. How much did I really know him? How much was he hiding? I needed answers. But where should I begin? The suspicion gnawed at me. I had to know for sure. Was he seeing someone else? Was this really about work, or was I just his cover? I couldn't sit idly by anymore, wondering. One evening, as he got dressed to go out, I made a decision. I wasn't going to sit at home this time, waiting. I was going to follow him. As soon as he left, I slipped on my shoes, grabbed my coat, and quietly followed behind him. My heart raced as I tried to stay at a distance. What if he caught me? What if he'd know I was there? But I had to know. I had to see it with my own eyes. His car turned down a street I didn't recognize. My pulse quickened. He pulled up to a dimly lit building. I parked a few blocks away, unsure of what I was about to discover. Could this really be the truth? What was he hiding? I watched from my car as he walked into a building, a warehouse, or something that resembled one. It was far from the usual bars or clubs he had always gone to, yet something about it felt off. It was dark, the windows tinted, almost as if it were meant to keep its contents hidden. For a moment, I sat frozen in my car, unsure if I should go inside. My heart pounded in my chest. I wasn't sure what I was expecting, but I knew it wasn't this. I had to see what he was doing, who he was meeting. I took a deep breath and stepped out of the car, keeping my distance as I approached the entrance. As I peered around a corner, I caught sight of a man in a full-body animal costume. My breath hitched. Was this some kind of joke? A theme party? But then I saw another man enter, dressed in a similar costume. And then it hit me. This wasn't just a gathering. This was something else entirely. Then, as if in slow motion, I saw him. My husband. He was standing in the middle of the room, surrounded by others, all wearing animal costumes. The laughter, the dancing, the carefree atmosphere. It was all so foreign, so different from the man I knew. I couldn't breathe. I had followed him here expecting the truth, but I hadn't expected this. He was dressed like an animal, furry, with a full mask covering his face. And there, in front of everyone, he was holding hands with another man. The two of them leaned in and kissed, passionately. I felt a cold rush of betrayal wash over me. My husband, the man I had loved, the man I had trusted, was here in this strange world, playing a part one didn't know existed. My stomach churned as I watched him. It wasn't just a casual affair. This was a completely different life, and I had no idea how to process it. I couldn't tear my eyes away. My husband, dressed as some kind of animal, was laughing, his hands caressing another man in a way he'd never touched me. I wanted to scream, to confront him right then and there, but I was frozen in place. The reality of what I was witnessing began to sink in, and a part of me wanted to run, but my feet wouldn't move. This wasn't just some harmless fetish. It was who he was. He was shedding his mask at this party, living a life I didn't even know existed. The man I married, the quiet, introverted man, had become this flamboyant figure in a furry costume, someone completely different from the person I thought I knew. I felt sick. This wasn't the life I imagined for us. He had hidden this entire world from me, a world where he was free to be whoever he wanted, and I was left in the dark. My mind raced. Could this really be happening? I was watching my husband in this wild, foreign world, a world I'd never even suspected existed. His laughter was carefree, his eyes alight with something I hadn't seen in years. He wasn't the man I married. He was someone else entirely. The way he looked at the other men, the affection, the connection, it was something he never gave me. I felt as though I were being erased, my place in his life no longer important. Was I just the cover? The perfect wife who kept up appearances while he lived out his true desires in secret? My heart thudded painfully in my chest. Could I ever trust him again? I had married a man who seemed perfect on the surface, but the truth was so much darker, so much more complex. And I was left standing here, watching it all crumble. The music blared as costumed figures danced in the corners of the warehouse. It was chaotic, yet strangely intimate. No one seemed to care about the world outside. This was their sanctuary, their freedom, and they didn't have to answer to anyone. I watched as my husband interacted with his new friends, his body language different, more open, more alive. It was as if he shed his old skin when he put on that costume, transforming into someone who could truly express himself. It was both horrifying and fascinating. I had never seen this side of him, never even imagined it existed. It made me feel like I had been living in a lie. The man I married wasn't just hiding his true desires. He was living in a parallel universe, one where he didn't have to pretend. And I was the stranger in his life, the outsider who wasn't invited into this world. The weight of betrayal crushed me. I had loved this man, trusted him, shared everything with him. And now, here I was, watching him kiss another man, something I never thought he'd do. How long had this been going on? How long had he kept this part of himself hidden from me? My mind raced with questions I couldn't answer. What had I missed? The signs had always been there. His distant behavior, his late nights, the way he became withdrawn. I had brushed it off as stress, as work troubles. But this was something else entirely. My stomach twisted as I thought of the years we had spent together. Were they real? Had I ever known the man I married? He had been living in a world where I didn't exist, and I was left to pick up the pieces of a broken trust. I stood frozen, watching him laugh, touch, and kiss other men. Part of me wanted to charge in, confront him, demand answers right here and now. But another part of me, a quieter part, was terrified. If I confronted him, would I be able to handle the truth? What if everything I knew was a lie? My chest tightened with fear. How could I face him after seeing this? And yet, how could I leave without knowing the full story? The questions overwhelmed me. I had to choose. I could either walk in and face him, risking everything, or I could run, escape before I learned something that would change everything. My heart wavered, torn between confronting him and escaping the pain. I had come this far, but now, standing on the edge, I wasn't sure I was ready to fall into the abyss. I couldn't stand there any longer. My feet moved on their own, carrying me toward him despite the fear that gripped me. The loud music and chatter faded as I approached, and soon, he noticed me. His eyes widened in shock, and his mouth fell open. "What are you doing here?" he stammered, his voice tight with panic. I wanted to shout, to demand answers, but my voice caught in my throat. Instead, I said nothing, just stared at him, at the man I no longer recognized, the man who had lied to me for so long. His face went pale as realization dawned on him. He quickly pulled away from the man he was with, his animal mask slipping slightly, revealing a hint of vulnerability I had never seen. He looked around, as though hoping the ground would swallow him whole. "This isn't what you think," he whispered, but I already knew. I waited for him to explain. Maybe, I thought, this was all a misunderstanding. Maybe there was an explanation that would make sense of it all. But as he stammered, his words fell flat. "It's just a phase," he said weakly, almost as if trying to convince himself more than me. "It's not about you. It's just a way to blow off steam. You wouldn't understand. The more he spoke, the less sense it made. A phase? How many other weekends had he spent like this? How many nights had he looked me in the eye, kissed me goodnight, and then slipped into this world without ever telling me? His words felt like empty promises, a thin veil over a deeper truth. I didn't mean for you to find out like this, he added, his voice trembling. But it wasn't the discovery that hurt. It was the betrayal, the lies he had wrapped me in. I looked at him, at his wild, fur-covered body, his mask now hanging loosely, and I couldn't recognize him anymore. This wasn't the man I married. This wasn't even the man I thought I knew. I wanted to scream, to shake him, to demand answers, but instead, I just stared. I had spent years building a life with someone who was living a secret I could never have imagined. His gaze dropped, his shame apparent. Please, he pleaded, you have to understand. This isn't about you. It's about me. It's about feeling free. The words were foreign, and yet they made sense. This was his escape. This wasn't a mistake, a one-time slip. This was who he had become when he wasn't with me. The person he had hidden from me for so long. My heart shattered, and I wondered if I had ever truly known him at all. The silence between us was unbearable. All I could hear was the hum of the music, the laughter of the others, and my own breath coming in shallow gasps. I stood there, unsure of what to do, torn between confronting him and walking away. What would confronting him achieve? What could he possibly say that would make any of this okay? I thought of the years we had spent together, the life we had built, and realized how little of it had been real. I was living a lie, and I couldn't keep pretending. I can't do this anymore, I said quietly, the words cutting through the air like a blade. His face contorted in shock and panic, but I couldn't look at him. You're not the man I married. I don't know who you are anymore. I turned and walked away, every step feeling heavier than the last. I left without looking back. The weight of the betrayal clung to me like a shadow, but I couldn't stay. I couldn't pretend everything was fine when it wasn't. The drive home was a blur of emotions: anger, sadness, confusion, and deep, painful loss. I couldn't believe how easily he had hidden this life from me. How had I missed the signs? How had I been so blind to the truth? When I arrived home, the silence greeted me like an old friend. The house felt empty, hollow. It wasn't just the absence of him. It was the absence of everything I thought I knew. My entire world had been built on a lie. I sat down in the living room, staring at the walls, the once comforting surroundings now feeling like a prison. What now? What did I do with the shattered pieces of my life? The silence in the house was deafening. I hadn't realized how much noise he had brought into my life. His laughter, his stories, the constant chatter about his work friends. But now, the silence felt suffocating. I couldn't bear to be in this house anymore, not without the person who had once meant everything to me. I sat there for hours, numb, unable to move. I replayed every moment in my mind, every detail that now seemed so glaringly obvious. How had I not seen it? How had I not known? The questions looped in my mind, but there were no answers. I had been living in a dream, and now I was awake, facing the brutal truth. I wondered if he was back at that party, surrounded by people who knew him in ways I never would. I wondered if he was happier without me. And yet, even with all the pain, I knew I was better off without him. I waited for the call. I waited for him to beg me to come back, to apologize, to explain. But it never came. Days turned into weeks, and still, there was nothing. Not a single word from him. I had expected him to chase me, to fight for me, to show that he regretted everything. But instead, it was as if I had disappeared from his life. His silence spoke volumes. It was as though I had never existed in his world at all. My heart sank every time I checked my phone, hoping to see his name, hoping for some sign that he was thinking about me. But nothing. It was as if I was just another forgotten chapter in his life, one that he could easily close and move on from. The realization hit me like a slap in the face. He had been living a double life, and I had been nothing more than a distraction to him. Letting go was harder than I ever imagined. My heart still ached for the life we had shared, for the future we had planned. But every time I thought about going back, I remembered the warehouse, the costumes, the man he had become. I wasn't part of his world, and he didn't seem to want me to be. I had spent years building a life with someone who wasn't real. The life I had imagined for us was a fantasy, one that had never been true. The hardest part was accepting that I wasn't enough. I had loved him, trusted him, and given him everything, but it wasn't enough. The man I thought I knew was gone, replaced by someone who didn't care about the life we shared. I couldn't keep holding on to something that had never really existed. But the ache in my chest, the longing for the man I had married, it wasn't so easily erased. Slowly, the truth began to settle in. My life had changed in ways I hadn't prepared for. I wasn't just dealing with a broken marriage. I was dealing with the unraveling of everything I thought I knew. The man I loved, the person I had built my life around, was gone. And now, I was left to pick up the pieces and figure out who I was without him. It felt like I was starting over, like everything I had built had been a lie. But in a way, it was also freeing. I had spent so long living for him, for us, that I had forgotten what it was like to live for myself. I started small, changing the way I decorated the house, reclaiming the space that had once been his as much as mine. Each change, no matter how small, felt like a step toward reclaiming my life. I wasn't sure where this new path would take me, but for the first time in months, I felt like I could breathe again. One evening, after weeks of silence, I received a message from him. It was short, almost dismissive. "I hope you're okay. I didn't want to hurt you." I read the words over and over, but they didn't bring me the closure I was looking for. They only reminded me of everything I had lost. I had spent so much time waiting for him to make it right, to come back and fix everything, but now I realized something. I didn't need him to fix me. I had already begun to heal on my own. I had been waiting for closure from him, but the truth was, I had already found it. The man I had loved was gone, and I had to accept that. There was no going back. I had to let go, not for him, but for me. I wasn't going to waste any more time waiting for someone who couldn't even give me the truth. Weeks passed, and I started to find a rhythm in my life without him. The pain, while still there, was beginning to dull. I was learning how to be alone again, how to live for myself. But just when I thought I had moved on, the doorbell rang one afternoon. I wasn't expecting anyone. When I opened the door, I found him standing there. My heart skipped a beat, but I quickly reminded myself, this wasn't the man I had married. He was no longer the man I knew. He looked different, his eyes tired, his clothes disheveled. "We need to talk," he said quietly, his voice low and shaky. For a moment, I wanted to let him in, to hear him out. But then I remembered everything. The lies, the secrets, the mask, and I knew nothing he could say would change what had happened. He stepped inside and sat down, his hands trembling as he looked at me, waiting for me to speak. But I had no words. Not anymore. I had heard enough excuses. "I'm sorry for everything," he began, his voice cracking. "I didn't mean to hurt you." His eyes were full of regret, but I couldn't trust them. Not anymore. The words felt hollow. Apologies meant nothing when they came too late, after everything had already fallen apart. I looked at him, the man I once loved, and realized that the apology he offered was just another way of trying to piece together a life that could never be fixed. I had heard all the reasons. He was confused, he needed freedom, he didn't know how to express himself, but none of it mattered. The man I had known was gone, and no amount of apologizing would bring him back. His apology hung in the air, but I didn't feel the rush of relief I had expected. Instead, I felt anger, betrayal, and, most of all, clarity. The tears that had threatened to fall for so long finally did, but they weren't for him. They were for the woman I had been, weak, confused, clinging to someone who had never truly seen me. "I can't do this anymore," I said firmly, my voice steady. "I can't keep holding on to someone who doesn't want me." The words were liberating. I realized in that moment that I was stronger than I had ever been. I didn't need him to define my worth, to make me feel complete. I had spent too long waiting for him to change, to come back to me, but I was done. I had found my strength, and I would never go back to the broken woman I had been. He sat there, stunned, as if he couldn't believe what I was saying. But I couldn't keep pretending. I had spent so much time justifying his actions, making excuses for his behavior, but it wasn't enough anymore. You don't get to come back and fix everything, I continued. You've broken something inside me that can't be repaired. His face fell, and for a moment, I felt a flicker of sympathy, but it quickly faded. He had had his chance. He had betrayed me, hidden a life from me, and now I was the one who had to face the truth. I couldn't let myself go back to that place where I was constantly questioning my worth. I deserved more than the scraps he had offered me. I deserved honesty, trust, and love. And that was something he could no longer give. He stood up, slowly, as if he couldn't believe what was happening. "You don't mean that," he said, his voice pleading. But I did mean it. With every fiber of my being, I meant it. I had tried. I had given everything, but I couldn't keep fighting for a relationship that no longer existed. "Goodbye," I whispered, the words heavy in the air between us. There was nothing more to say. He had made his choices, and now I was making mine. I walked him to the door, and as I closed it behind him, I felt the weight of everything we had been slowly slip away. It wasn't easy, but it was necessary. I was letting go, not because I didn't love him anymore, but because I had finally learned that love wasn't enough if it wasn't returned. I wasn't going to let myself be a prisoner of someone else's lies anymore. The door closed, and suddenly, the house felt quieter than ever. The echoes of the life I had once shared with him faded into the background. The stillness felt oppressive at first, but then it started to settle over me like a blanket, comforting in its own strange way. I wasn't sure how to feel, whether I should cry or scream, but instead, I felt a deep sense of relief. I had closed a chapter that had dragged on for too long. The silence that followed was not the painful kind. It was the kind that allowed me to breathe again, to reclaim the space that had been tainted by his lies. The next morning, I woke up and looked around. It was still my home, and for the first time in months, it felt like mine again. No more secrets. No more pretending. The silence, in its own way, was my new beginning. It's hard to move on when there's still a part of you that loves the person who hurt you. Forgiveness isn't something that comes easily, especially when the wound is so deep. I wanted to forgive him. I wanted to move on without the burden of bitterness or resentment. But how could I? How could I forget the lies, the deceit, the way he had shattered everything I believed in? I told myself that forgiveness was the key to healing, but every time I thought about him, I felt the anger rise up again. It wasn't fair. I had given him everything, and he had thrown it all away for a fantasy, a lie. But as time passed, I started to realize something. Forgiveness wasn't about him. It was about me. It was about letting go of the anger that was holding me captive. I had to forgive, not for him, but for my own peace. Even after everything, the fear of being alone still crept in. I had been with him for so long, and the idea of starting over, of facing the world alone, terrified me. I had forgotten what it was like to be independent, to make decisions just for myself. For years, my life had revolved around him, his needs, his desires. Now, I had to find my own path, and it was overwhelming. What if I wasn't enough on my own? What if I failed? The thought of being alone, really alone, sent a chill down my spine. But as the days went on, I began to realize something. I wasn't truly alone. I had me. I had my strength, my resilience, and the ability to rebuild my life. The fear didn't disappear, but it became something I could manage. I wasn't alone. I was just starting a new chapter, one where I was in control. One morning, I woke up and realized something profound. I didn't need him to complete me. I didn't need anyone to complete me. For so long, I had felt like there was something missing, like I wasn't whole without him. But now, I could see that I had always been whole. I had been just fine before him, and I would be just fine after him. The awakening was slow, but it was undeniable. I had been looking for love and validation in the wrong places. I had been waiting for someone else to make me feel worthy, to fill the emptiness I felt inside. But the truth was, the only person who could fill that void was me. I was the one who had to love myself first. I had to believe that I was enough, even without anyone else's approval. And once I realized that, everything else fell into place. It had been months since I had walked away, and in that time, I had transformed. I wasn't the same person I had been when I first discovered his lies. I had grown stronger, more independent, more confident in who I was. I had reclaimed my life, piece by piece, and I was finally starting to feel like myself again. The fear, the sadness, the anger, they were all still there, lurking in the background, but they no longer defined me. I was ready for something new, a new chapter, a new adventure. I wasn't sure what the future held, but I knew one thing for sure. I was in control. I had taken back my power, and I was moving forward with my head held high. The past was behind me, and the future was mine to shape. I thought I was done with him. I had moved on, rebuilt my life, and was finally in a place where I could breathe again. But one afternoon, I received an unexpected message. It was from him. My heart raced as I stared at the screen, unsure of what to feel. I had told myself I was over him, but seeing his name again stirred something inside me. The message was simple. I need to talk. Please let me explain. For a moment, I considered ignoring it. I had already closed that door. But then, curiosity got the better of me. I wanted to know what he had to say, what he could possibly say after everything. I agreed to meet, but this time, it would be different. I was no longer that woman who would sit quietly and listen to his excuses. I was stronger, wiser, and prepared for whatever he had to say. When we met, he looked different. There was a vulnerability in his eyes, a rawness that I hadn't seen before. He apologized again, but this time, it wasn't just words. It was the kind of apology that seemed to come from the depths of his soul. I didn't realize what I had until I lost it, he admitted, his voice breaking. The truth is, I was ashamed of myself, of what I had become. I wasn't happy. I needed something that I couldn't explain, something I thought would fill the emptiness inside me. But it only made things worse. His confession felt like a weight lifting from his shoulders, but it didn't make me feel any better. The man I had once loved was still gone. I listened, but the truth didn't change the fact that everything had already been broken beyond repair. As he spoke, I found myself asking questions I had never dared to ask before. Why had he let it go so far? Why had he chosen to hide his true self from me for so long? He had been so careful, so secretive, that I had never suspected a thing. How had I missed the signs? Was I so blind, so consumed by the life we had built together, that I had ignored the cracks? Why didn't you come to me? I asked, my voice steady but filled with pain. Why didn't you tell me the truth? His answer was simple but heartbreaking. I was afraid. Afraid of losing you. Afraid of your rejection. But as the words left his mouth, I realized something. His fear wasn't the reason for his betrayal. It was just an excuse. The truth was, he had been living a lie, and I was the one left to pick up the pieces. We sat there in silence for a long time after that, both of us processing everything that had been said. The years we had spent together, the love, the lies, all of it felt like a distant memory. I had wanted closure, but I realized that no amount of words would ever bring me the peace I needed. The truth was out, but the damage had already been done. He reached for my hand, but I pulled away. I don't need your touch anymore, I said, my voice firm. I don't need your explanations. The finality of my words hung in the air between us, heavy and undeniable. There was no going back from this. The man I had loved was no longer a part of my life, and I had to accept that. We had come to the end of the road, and it was time for us to part ways for good. As I walked away from him that day, I felt a strange sense of peace. It wasn't the kind of peace that came from forgiveness or understanding. It was the kind that came from knowing I had made the right decision. I had fought for our marriage. I had tried to understand him, but I couldn't keep sacrificing my own happiness for someone who couldn't even be honest with me. I had learned the hard way that love wasn't enough to keep a relationship together. Trust was everything, and he had broken that trust beyond repair. But now, I was free. Free from the lies, free from the weight of the past. I didn't know what the future held, but I knew I had the strength to face it. I was no longer living in the shadow of the man I once loved. I was moving forward, and nothing was going to hold me back. The first few weeks after he left were the hardest. I felt like a shell of who I once was, like a piece of me had been ripped away. But as time passed, I began to rebuild. Slowly, piece by piece, I started to reclaim the life I had lost. I started small, rearranging furniture in the house, redecorating, even cooking meals for myself. It was as if I was learning to live for the first time in years. I joined a yoga class, reconnected with old friends, and found joy in things I had long forgotten. I realized that I had been so consumed by him, by the relationship, that I had lost myself in the process. But now, I was finding her again, stronger, wiser, and ready to take on whatever came next. Rebuilding wasn't easy, but it was necessary. And with each passing day, I felt more like myself than I had in a long time. Despite the progress I had made, there were days when doubt crept in. I found myself questioning everything. Was I really strong enough to move on? Was I making the right decision? What if he was the one I was meant to be with? The questions swirled in my mind, but every time they came, I reminded myself of the truth of what he had done, the lies he had told, the way he had betrayed my trust. I couldn't ignore that. I couldn't pretend that things had been okay when they hadn't. And I couldn't keep allowing myself to question my decision when I knew deep down that I had done the right thing. The doubts were natural, I told myself, but they were just remnants of the past, trying to pull me back. And I wouldn't let them. With the emptiness of the past behind me, I started to search for something deeper. For the first time in a long time, I realized that I had no clear purpose. I had spent so many years being part of a couple, living for him and our life together, that I had forgotten to live for myself. I began asking myself what I truly wanted. What did I need to feel fulfilled? I started by exploring new hobbies, things I had always wanted to try but had never had the time for. I began writing again, something I had loved before I got lost in the relationship. I traveled, not with him by my side, but on my own terms. It was liberating to make decisions for myself, without worrying about what anyone else thought. Slowly, I began to rediscover passions that had been buried for far too long. Just when I thought I had moved past the worst of it, a moment of doubt hit me like a wave. I ran into him on a street corner one afternoon, and for a second, everything felt like it had been before. He looked the same, sounded the same, but something in my gut told me everything had changed. He was still the same man, but I wasn't the same woman. I was stronger, more confident, and I realized in that moment that I didn't need him anymore. Yet, despite everything I had been through, there was a part of me that still longed for what we had once shared, for the comfort, for the love that I thought we had. But then I remembered the truth, the betrayal, the lies, and just like that, the longing faded. I wasn't going to go back to that life. I had already come too far. After the chance encounter, something clicked in me. I didn't need to prove anything anymore. Not to him, not to anyone. I had spent so much of my life trying to make sense of things, trying to fix what couldn't be fixed. But now, I realized that the only thing I needed to do was move forward. The life we had was gone, and no amount of longing or regret could bring it back. I had to stop living in the past. I had to embrace the future, no matter how uncertain it seemed. The realization was liberating. It was like a weight had been lifted off my shoulders, and for the first time in months, I felt free. Free to live my life without the burden of him. Free to be who I was without any doubts or fears holding me back. This was my life now, and I was ready to live it to the fullest. In the weeks that followed, I discovered a strength within myself that I didn't know existed. It was subtle at first, small moments where I chose to take control of my emotions instead of letting them control me. There were nights when I still cried, nights when the loneliness felt unbearable, but they were becoming fewer and farther between. With each passing day, I found new ways to fill the emptiness he had left behind. I reached out to friends, spent more time doing the things that made me happy, and I started to feel a sense of purpose again. It wasn't about being strong all the time. It was about allowing myself to feel what I needed to feel, but never letting it define me. The strength wasn't in avoiding the pain. It was in facing it and continuing to move forward, no matter how difficult it seemed. I started to look at my life differently. What had once seemed like an endless cycle of disappointment and heartbreak now felt like an opportunity for renewal. I wasn't just living, I was thriving. The house that had once been filled with lies now felt like a sanctuary. I had transformed it into a space that was all my own, a place where I could be myself without fear or judgment. I started going out more, exploring the world around me, rediscovering the parts of myself I had buried for so long. The new life I was building was mine and mine alone. It was exhilarating. There were still moments of doubt, of course, but they no longer held power over me. I had come so far, and there was no turning back now. One evening, a friend convinced me to go out with her. She had been urging me for weeks to get back into the dating world, but I wasn't sure I was ready. Still, I agreed to join her for a casual drink, telling myself it would just be fun. The bar was cozy, warm, filled with the sounds of laughter and music. As we sat down, a man approached and introduced himself. He was kind, easy to talk to, and surprisingly attentive. At first, I was hesitant, unsure of how to interact with someone who wasn't him. But as the night wore on, I found myself laughing more freely, enjoying the conversation, and feeling something I hadn't felt in a long time: connection. It was nothing serious, but the experience opened a door in me. Maybe, just maybe, I wasn't done with love after all. The next few weeks were a whirlwind of mixed emotions. The first date had sparked something in me, but there was still a nagging fear deep inside. How could I trust again after everything that had happened? How could I allow someone new into my life when I still carried the scars of my past? I had been burned so badly, and the thought of opening myself up again terrified me. But as I spent more time with this new person, I realized that not everyone was like him. Not everyone would betray me, lie to me, or break my heart. I had to remind myself that the past didn't define the future. Trusting again wasn't about forgetting the pain. It was about learning from it and moving forward. It was a process, one step at a time, and I was willing to take it. One night, as I sat in my living room, reflecting on everything I had been through, a wave of clarity washed over me. I had come so far. The pain, the betrayal, the confusion, they were all part of my journey, but they no longer held me captive. I had learned so much about myself, about my strength, my resilience, and my capacity for growth. I wasn't the same woman who had been blindsided by his lies. I was someone new, someone who had fought for her happiness and had found it. The future was still uncertain, but I no longer feared it. I was no longer defined by my past. I was defined by the choices I made, by the person I was becoming. And in that moment, I knew I was ready for whatever came next. As I continued to rebuild my life, I began to form new connections with people who truly understood me. No longer was I surrounded by the weight of his presence in every conversation, every interaction. I met people who respected my journey, who listened without judgment. I realized that true friendships were built on understanding and mutual respect, not the false comforts I had once clung to. I started spending time with people who inspired me to be better, to pursue my passions, and to take risks. With each new connection, I felt less alone in the world. I wasn't just surviving anymore. I was thriving. And as I embraced these new relationships, I felt a deeper sense of belonging. This was the support I had needed all along, the kind that lifted me up and made me feel whole. Forgiveness had always seemed like an impossible goal. How could I forgive someone who had torn apart my life? But as time went on, I began to understand that forgiveness wasn't about excusing his actions. It was about freeing myself from the anger and resentment that had held me captive for so long. One evening, as I sat in quiet reflection, I made the decision to forgive him, not for his sake, but for mine. I had carried that bitterness for so long, and it was weighing me down. I couldn't let it control me any longer. Forgiveness didn't mean I would forget what he had done, but it meant that I was no longer going to let him have power over my life. It was a difficult step, but one that brought me closer to healing. The more I healed, the more I realized how much I had grown. I had always thought that love and loyalty were the ultimate test of strength, but I learned that true strength came from within. It came from the ability to rise after every fall, to keep moving forward even when the road ahead seemed impossible. I wasn't the person I had been when I first discovered his lies. I was stronger, more independent, and more aware of my worth. The woman I had become was someone who didn't need anyone to complete her, someone who could stand on her own 2 feet and face whatever came her way. And while the scars of the past would always be a part of me, they no longer defined me. I was more than my pain. I was more than my past. One evening, I found myself standing outside, looking up at the stars. It was a quiet moment, one of those rare times when everything felt still, when the noise of life faded away. And in that silence, I realized something profound. I was free. Free from the weight of his lies, free from the chains of resentment that had once held me captive. I had fought for my freedom, and now I had it. It wasn't just about leaving him behind. It was about reclaiming my life, my happiness, and my future. The world was full of possibilities, and for the first time in years, I felt ready to embrace them. The freedom was intoxicating. I had built my life back from the ground up, and now, nothing was off limits. As I looked toward the future, I realized that the path ahead was mine to create. I wasn't bound by the past anymore, and I wasn't going to let fear or doubt stop me from pursuing my dreams. There was a sense of excitement bubbling within me, a feeling that everything I had gone through had prepared me for something greater. I began to make plans, not just for the immediate future, but for the long term. There were places I wanted to visit, goals I wanted to achieve, and dreams I wanted to make a reality. I no longer saw myself as a victim of circumstances. I saw myself as a woman with infinite potential. The journey wasn't over. It was just beginning. And with each step, I felt more confident, more sure of the life I was creating for myself.